Tomas Villalobos was a name that few knew, but his presence loomed like a shadow across the criminal underworld. To many, he was a myth, an elusive figure whose influence was felt but never seen. The mountainous landscapes of northern Mexico, with their rugged, winding paths and hidden caves, formed the backdrop of his life, a life shrouded in mystery. And though his story was often overshadowed by the larger-than-life figures who ruled the streets of cities, Tomas was quietly carving out a legacy of his own, one that would remain in the shadows, far removed from the public eye. In the darkest corners of the world, where the cartel wars raged and power was measured in blood, Tomas chose silence over spectacle. Where others demanded attention, he reveled in being unseen. Unlike the notorious names that peppered headlines, his name was whispered only in the hushed corners of the criminal elite, spoken by those who had heard of his brilliance but knew better than to call attention to it. His story is one of quiet power, of a man who wielded control over an empire with a steady hand and an unseen gaze. He didn't need to boast, to show off his wealth, or even to flaunt his violent tendencies. In a world where attention was often the most dangerous thing you could seek, Tomas understood that the most powerful people in the room were those who didn't need to be seen. The Mountain Syndicate, an organization built on secrecy and strategy, had risen not by brute force but by intelligence, by the quiet manipulation of resources, alliances, and the unseen threads that ran deep within the criminal fabric of Mexico. But what made Tomas unique was not just his ability to build a network of power. It was his complete disinterest in the fame that came with it. While his counterparts built empires that were flamboyant and terrifying, Tomas preferred the calm of the shadows. He didn't want to be known, he didn't need the validation of recognition. To Tomas, the true power was in remaining a mystery, in maintaining an air of uncertainty. People feared the unknown, and he had mastered that art. His face was rarely seen, his voice seldom heard, yet the name, Shadow Tunnel, echoed in hushed circles with reverence, a title that whispered of his ability to move unseen, to operate in the most perilous of environments without leaving a trace. The mountains where he operated were as much a part of his legend as the men who served him. The jagged peaks, dense forests, and labyrinthine caves made for an ideal hideout. They were both his sanctuary and his weapon, offering him protection and a place to plan. As law enforcement, rival syndicates, and even former allies sought to uncover the truth of Tomas' dealings, they found nothing but walls of stone and silence. The deeper they ventured, the more elusive he became. To understand Tomas was to understand the mountains themselves, complex, mysterious, and deadly. And like those mountains, Tomas seemed to defy any attempt to understand him fully. But behind this enigmatic figure was a mind sharp as any blade, capable of reading people with precision, of calculating risks with a steady hand. It was in the careful arrangement of people and places, of routes and safe houses, that Tomas made his mark on the criminal world. His operation ran like clockwork, unseen, unnoticed, but incredibly effective. Unlike the large, chaotic operations that crumbled under the weight of their own success, Tomas' syndicate thrived in the background, impervious to the usual threats that brought down others. For years, his name was one that people spoke about only in whispers. Those who knew of him were often too terrified to speak openly. But the myth of Tomas Villalobos, of the shadowy figure who built an empire from the mountains, began to grow. Stories of his skill and his ability to outthink anyone who dared challenge him began to take on a life of their own. Some claimed he was untouchable, others believed he was a ghost, someone who existed only in the minds of those who needed an explanation for their unexplained failures. What made Tomas rise to power all the more fascinating was the fact that, even as his network expanded, he never sought the limelight. While other cartel leaders craved fame, Tomas carefully crafted his legacy through strategy, patience, and discretion. He operated in the background, a force of nature that others felt but could never quite identify. Even his closest allies understood that Tomas wasn't someone to be fully understood. His motivations were a puzzle, his actions often a mystery. It was this combination of intelligence and invisibility that set Tomas apart. While the world focused on the larger, more explosive figures of the criminal world, Tomas quietly shaped the Mountain Syndicate into one of the most dangerous and influential organizations in Mexico. It was the perfect mix of power and anonymity, where those who didn't know Tomas respected him, and those who did feared him. The calm of his existence, the quiet nature of his operations, made him a legend, one that no one truly understood, but everyone respected. As the story of Tomas Villalobos unfolds, we will see how a man who refused to be seen became one of the most feared and respected figures in the criminal underworld, his influence stretching far beyond the mountains and into the very heart of Mexico's darkest corners. Tomas Villalobos was born in a small, remote village nestled deep in the heart of Mexico. The village, which was little more than a collection of adobe houses scattered along winding dirt roads, had a quiet, timeless feel. It was a place untouched by the rapid changes sweeping through the rest of the world, where life moved slowly, dictated by the sun and the seasons. The village was surrounded by vast, untamed landscapes, the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre to the north, and endless stretches of desert to the south. The land itself seemed as rough and unforgiving as the people who lived on it. Here, Tomas' journey began, and though the world would come to know him as the shadowy architect of one of Mexico's most powerful criminal syndicates, his origins were far humbler. In Tomas' early years, the village seemed like a world of its own. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the gossip of the elders swirled in the dusty air as children played in the streets. Yet, despite the close-knit community, Tomas always felt a sense of being apart. While his peers found comfort in the familiar rhythms of village life, Tomas felt an undeniable pull to something greater. It wasn't that the village was oppressive, on the contrary, it offered a simple, if not entirely content, existence. But Tomas, even as a young boy, understood the harsh reality that life in such a place would offer little beyond what it already had. There was no room for ambition, no space for anything beyond survival. And for Tomas, survival was never enough. His family, like many others in the village, struggled to make ends meet. His father was a laborer who worked the fields by day and did what he could to support the family by night, while his mother spent her time tending to the house and raising Tomas and his younger siblings. The couple loved their children deeply, but their lives were bound by the constraints of poverty. Tomas witnessed firsthand the hardships of this life, his father's tired hands, his mother's weary smile, and he felt a simmering resentment. He saw that the life his parents led was dictated by forces beyond their control, the land, the economy, the government, and the criminal networks that occasionally made their way through the village. Tomas understood early that these forces controlled everything. For him, it was never a question of whether he would leave the village, but when and how. At school, Tomas was a quiet, reserved student, but he was always curious. He observed the world around him, soaking in details that others overlooked. While many of his peers dreamed of little more than finding work in the fields or joining the local militia, Tomas' thoughts were often far more distant, his imagination drifting to the hidden workings of the world outside the village. He would often listen intently to the tales shared by the travelers who passed through, strangers who spoke of cities filled with riches, men who controlled vast networks of power, and even more mysterious figures who operated beyond the law. These stories captivated Tomas, and as he grew older, he began to understand that the world beyond the village was as dangerous as it was alluring. He realized that in order to escape his circumstances, he would have to become part of that world, a world where power and influence could make one untouchable. But Tomas wasn't the type to pursue power recklessly. Even as a teenager, he displayed a quiet intelligence, a deep understanding of how the world worked, and how it could be manipulated. His first real taste of the underworld came in the form of his uncle, a distant relative who had moved to the city years before. His uncle would occasionally return to the village, carrying with him a mysterious air, his pockets always bulging with cash, his car gleaming with the kind of luxury Tomas had only seen in films. His uncle, a man of few words, never explicitly spoke of his connections, but Tomas could feel the weight of something darker behind his presence. It was the first real inkling Tomas had that the life he longed for wasn't just about escaping poverty, it was about understanding how to navigate the complex systems that made men powerful. Through these visits, Tomas began to learn that in order to thrive in the world beyond his village, he would have to master the art of influence, control, and, most importantly, secrecy. His uncle never gave him direct lessons on the criminal world, but Tomas observed carefully, noticing how people would treat his uncle with a mixture of respect and fear. Tomas saw how his uncle's influence extended not just in the city, but across the rural areas where corruption ran deep. The men who worked for him seemed to know exactly where to place their trust, and where to place their knives. As Tomas entered his 20s, the idea of escaping the village took on a more urgent tone. He began to make small moves to break free from the life his family had led. He would occasionally take odd jobs in the nearby towns, saving what little money he earned. In his spare time, he began to study the landscape of criminal networks in Mexico, learning everything he could about the cartels, the smuggling routes, and the underworld that pulsed beneath the surface of everyday life. Tomas knew that if he were to succeed, he would have to stay out of sight and never make the mistake of showing too much ambition too soon. He couldn't afford to be seen as just another man eager for power, he needed to be seen as something different. He needed to be the invisible hand that moved everything without anyone knowing it was him. It was in the bustling city of Monterrey, several hours from his village, where Tomas would make his first serious connection to the underworld. By then, he had shed the remnants of his rural upbringing, adopting a more urban persona that allowed him to blend in with the men who dominated the criminal landscape. Here, Tomas would meet men who would change the course of his life forever, men who understood the delicate balance between violence and strategy, who knew how to play the game of organized crime without ever raising their voices. But Tomas knew that his true power wouldn't come from brute force or the ability to intimidate. It would come from his ability to stay hidden in plain sight, to manipulate events without leaving a trace. And as he began to form the early connections that would later become the Mountain Syndicate, he understood one thing above all else: he could never be the face of the operation. He could never be the one the world saw. Tomas Villalobos was going to be something far greater than a simple criminal. He was going to be a shadow, an architect, a man whose name would never be known, but whose influence would be felt across the entire criminal world. In the heart of Monterrey, Tomas Villalobos found himself in the midst of a world he had only studied from afar. The noise of the city was deafening, a cacophony of traffic, conversations, and the constant hum of urban life. But Tomas had come to the city not for its distractions, but for the opportunity to forge connections that would eventually elevate him beyond his humble beginnings. Here, he would make his first real foray into the world of organized crime, a world that demanded both subtlety and ruthlessness. It was in the smoky back rooms of small cantinas and the quiet corners of shady bars that Tomas learned the art of survival in the underworld. The men he met were not the brash, attention-seeking figures one might expect from cartel bosses. Instead, they were calm, composed, and often cold as ice. Tomas quickly realized that the real power didn't come from intimidation or brute force, it came from knowledge, strategy, and, most importantly, discretion. He watched how these men conducted their business: silent negotiations, subtle gestures, and the careful deployment of resources to create an empire that operated just below the radar. Tomas's first steps into this world were small. He didn't rush in, demanding power or recognition. Instead, he took a slower, more deliberate approach, understanding that respect in the criminal world was earned over time. He made himself useful, working odd jobs for various figures who controlled the smaller operations around Monterrey. He moved between the edges of cartel territories, learning the ropes of smuggling, extortion, and even money laundering. He didn't take anything for granted. Every move, every conversation, was an opportunity to learn. One of his earliest lessons came from a man named Raúl El Gato Herrera, a low-level enforcer who had earned a reputation for being ruthlessly efficient without ever making a spectacle of his actions. El Gato ran a network that dealt in extortion and smuggling, a network that, while not the largest, had a reputation for being impenetrable. Tomas didn't want to be just another worker in the shadows. He wanted to understand how men like El Gato could move through the world with such precision, their operations thriving without the kind of chaos that typically surrounded larger cartels. What Tomas saw in El Gato was a blueprint, a way to create an empire not by sheer force, but by becoming a linchpin in a system, the unseen hand that moved everything behind the scenes. As Tomas worked with El Gato, he began to develop an understanding of what it took to build something lasting. It wasn't enough to simply be ruthless. To control a network, you had to think ahead, anticipate challenges, and know exactly how to position yourself so that you were always one step ahead of your enemies. El Gato never showed his emotions, never revealed his plans. His word was final, but it was never spoken loudly. Tomas learned quickly that in the world he was entering, silence could be far more dangerous than noise. And in that silence, he found a space where he could operate with a level of discretion that would later define his own approach. By now, Tomas had developed an impeccable understanding of how to move in the shadows, but he still lacked one crucial element: power. It wasn't enough to simply be part of the underworld. He needed to build his own network, a network that could stand on its own without relying on the figures he had worked for. But Tomas wasn't in a hurry. He understood that building true influence took time, patience, and careful planning. He knew he had to play the long game. Around this time, Tomas encountered a man named Hector La Sombra Romero, a mid-level drug lord with connections throughout northern Mexico. Hector had built his empire by managing the delicate relationships between cartels, rival gangs, and corrupt officials. He was known for his ability to mediate conflicts and broker deals, skills that Tomas admired and hoped to emulate. While Hector was more open about his ambitions and less discreet than Tomas, he was no less dangerous. Hector understood the value of strategic alliances, and it was through him that Tomas began to form the relationships that would later prove essential to his rise. But Tomas knew that Hector was not the man he wanted to become. Hector's world was one of constant conflict, of shifting allegiances and violent power struggles. Tomas wanted something more, something that would ensure his survival even in the most uncertain times. He realized that the key to his success would lie in maintaining control without ever needing to be at the center of the chaos. He needed to stay out of the spotlight, to influence events without being seen as the orchestrator. Tomas's growing reputation as a calm, calculated operator began to precede him. As the months passed, he became known in certain circles as a man to watch, someone who had the potential to grow into something much bigger than he appeared. Tomas's skill in maintaining a low profile became his most valuable asset. He understood the importance of being elusive, of keeping his movements subtle and untraceable. He never let anyone know his true intentions or the depth of his ambitions. His silence was his weapon, and as his influence began to grow, so did his reputation. People began to notice that when Tomas was involved in a situation, things tended to fall into place, disputes were resolved, deals were made, and enemies were neutralized, often without anyone even knowing Tomas had been the one to pull the strings. In time, Tomas became a figure who operated on the fringes of the larger cartel wars, positioning himself as a mediator between rival factions. He understood that his true power lay not in having a massive army of enforcers, but in the ability to bring people together and make them believe that they were better off working with him than against him. As Tomas continued to build his reputation, he began to gather a small but loyal group of followers, men who shared his vision of a more subtle, less volatile form of power. His first major move came when he brokered a deal between two warring factions, both of which were on the brink of collapse due to their incessant infighting. Tomas didn't try to seize control. Instead, he offered a solution that allowed both sides to save face and come out with something valuable. It wasn't a flashy move, but it was incredibly effective. In a world where most cartel leaders gained power through sheer violence, Tomas had learned that the true art of control lay in the ability to negotiate, to manipulate events behind the scenes, and to create a network that was more efficient and less prone to instability. From that point forward, Tomas began to make his mark as a man who could build something stronger than any single cartel or syndicate, a network that would remain hidden in the shadows, operating with precision and efficiency. Tomas Villalobos may not have been the most visible figure in the underworld, but his name was becoming synonymous with quiet control. It was a lesson he had learned well: power was not about showing strength, but about creating a system that could not be easily disrupted. And with every successful negotiation, every alliance formed, Tomas moved one step closer to realizing his vision of becoming the unseen architect of the Mountain Syndicate. As Tomas Villalobos began to solidify his presence in Monterrey, his small network began to take shape. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but rather a slow, methodical buildup of trust, strategy, and influence. Tomas knew that every decision, every word spoken in private, and every alliance forged had to be calculated with precision. Unlike his counterparts who relied on brute force and intimidation to expand their control, Tomas was building something more subtle, more enduring. He was laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the Mountain Syndicate, a name that would come to represent an empire of power and discretion, built from the shadows. The first real test of Tomas's capabilities came when a local cartel, known as Los Halcones, began encroaching on the territory controlled by his mentors. Los Halcones, led by the ruthless Victor El Lobo Garcia, had been expanding aggressively throughout northern Mexico. Known for their violent tactics, they sought to dominate the area by eliminating anyone who stood in their way. Tomas's allies saw the growing threat, and while some wanted to take immediate action, Tomas held back. He knew that moving too quickly, showing aggression, or trying to retaliate with violence would only escalate the conflict and draw unwanted attention. Instead, Tomas watched carefully, studying the situation from all angles. In the weeks that followed, Tomas put his plan into motion, but it wasn't one of direct confrontation. He knew that in order to deal with El Lobo and his men, he needed to hit them where they were weakest, not in the open, but in the unseen networks of commerce, supply, and communication that fueled their operations. Tomas's first move was to cut off some of the vital smuggling routes that Los Halcones used to move drugs and weapons. His actions were calculated and deliberate, designed not to draw attention but to create a ripple effect within the cartel's infrastructure. He reached out to a group of small-time smugglers who had been operating under the radar, some of whom were on the brink of bankruptcy. They were no match for Los Halcones in terms of power or resources, but Tomas saw an opportunity to bring them under his influence. Through a combination of offers and quiet threats, Tomas made them an offer they couldn't refuse. If they stopped working with El Lobo's men and began working exclusively for him, he would ensure that their operations stayed uninterrupted. Tomas knew that in the underworld, the value of a reliable supply chain was immeasurable. By taking control of these smuggling routes, he not only weakened Los Halcones, but he also gained valuable leverage that would allow him to position himself as a key player in the region's logistics. It didn't take long for El Lobo to notice that his supply chains were being disrupted. At first, he thought it was just a series of bad luck, but as the disruptions grew more frequent, he began to suspect that someone was deliberately undermining him. The frustration within Los Halcones grew, and internal strife began to simmer. Tomas, ever the tactician, was playing the long game. He knew that El Lobo's men would be forced to look inward, suspecting their own people of betrayal before they would ever consider the idea of an external threat. Tomas's reputation as a quiet and invisible figure worked in his favor, as no one had yet linked him directly to the disruption. He was the phantom in the machine, pulling strings without ever making a sound. As the months passed, Tomas's network continued to grow. He made more and more connections, carefully forging alliances with other smaller factions and criminal groups, all while keeping a low profile. His influence spread without ever drawing attention to itself, creating a web of loyalty and trust that was hard to break. His ability to remain unseen was his greatest asset, allowing him to work from the shadows while his rivals scrambled in the open, making enemies and attracting attention. By the time El Lobo finally decided to take direct action, it was already too late. Los Halcones, weakened by the disruptions Tomas had caused, were not the formidable force they had once been. Tomas, having played his cards carefully, had already secured a stronger position. In a series of clandestine meetings, he negotiated with the remaining factions who had once been part of Los Halcones' territory. Without firing a single shot, Tomas had neutralized one of the most dangerous threats in the region. He didn't need to fight El Lobo head-on. Instead, he used his skill for negotiation and his ability to manipulate the complex networks of the criminal world to dismantle Los Halcones from within. It was a move that would define Tomas's reputation as a master strategist, a man who could control an entire region without ever revealing his true intentions. But Tomas's success in Monterrey was only the beginning. As his network expanded, so did the threats against him. The larger cartels in Mexico, particularly the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels, began to take notice of his growing influence. While Tomas had avoided direct confrontation, it was clear that his presence was now being felt by the big players in the game. Tomas had to adapt once again, and this time, he would need to be even more discreet. The stakes were higher, and the risks greater. But Tomas, with his calm demeanor and patient approach, was not intimidated. He knew that in order to survive in the world of organized crime, he had to be like water, shapeless, adaptable, and capable of flowing around any obstacle that stood in his way. It wasn't long before Tomas realized that the key to his survival would lie in creating an alliance with those who could offer him protection and resources. While he wasn't interested in directly working for any of the larger cartels, he understood that some level of cooperation was necessary to ensure his position. Tomas's ability to broker deals without drawing attention to himself made him an invaluable asset to the larger criminal organizations. He became a silent partner to several influential figures, offering his logistical expertise and strategic thinking in exchange for the protection he needed to continue growing his syndicate. Tomas had always understood the value of patience, but now, more than ever, he knew that the road ahead would require a level of diplomacy and subtlety that few others could master. His network had to remain elusive, but it also had to be strong enough to withstand the pressure from rival cartels and law enforcement. Tomas's mastery of the unseen was his greatest weapon. While others waged open wars for control, Tomas quietly built a power structure that could never be fully understood, yet always commanded respect. In time, Tomas's syndicate, the Mountain Syndicate, as it would come to be known, began to take shape as a formidable force. It was not built on violence, nor was it established through fear alone. It was built on intelligence, patience, and the careful manipulation of the underworld's many moving parts. Tomas Villalobos had created an empire not through the violence of his enemies, but through his ability to remain hidden, to move without leaving a trace, and to build alliances that would ensure his control for years to come. As his influence expanded, Tomas continued to operate from the shadows, a figure whose name was whispered with both awe and fear. He had become a master of the game, a man who controlled not with power, but with precision. The Mountain Syndicate was now a reality, and Tomas Villalobos had become a name that no one could ignore, even if they didn't fully understand who he was or how he had achieved such power. The growth of Tomas Villalobos's network didn't come without its challenges. As he expanded his influence across the northern regions of Mexico, he began to encounter a new breed of rivalries, ones that weren't just about territorial control, but about power, ego, and the unpredictable volatility that accompanied ambition. While Tomas had always operated in the shadows, careful to avoid drawing attention, there were those who didn't share his subtlety. His success had attracted the notice of not only cartel leaders but also local politicians, law enforcement, and even businessmen with deep pockets who wanted a piece of the growing underworld economy. It was clear that Tomas had moved beyond the small-time smuggling operations he had once managed. His syndicate had grown to encompass a variety of illicit activities, drug trafficking, extortion, money laundering, arms dealing, but now he was entering an even more complex and dangerous arena, organized crime on a national scale. The rules of engagement had changed, and Tomas had to adjust his methods to maintain control. For every step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps back, as new competitors and threats arose from unexpected places. Tomas was no longer just a player in the game, he had become a target. One of the most significant threats came from a rising figure within the Jalisco New Generation cartel, CJNG, a faction known for its unrelenting aggression and violence. This cartel had quickly risen to prominence, using extreme force to establish dominance across Mexico. Tomas had long known that the CJNG's reach was expanding, but he had avoided direct conflict, relying on his alliances and strategic thinking to stay out of their radar. That was, until one fateful meeting. It happened at a quiet, unassuming restaurant on the outskirts of Monterrey, a place where Tomas had done business before, far removed from the chaos of the city. He had met with a trusted associate, discussing the expansion of his syndicate's operations into the neighboring states. But that day, the conversation was interrupted. A new player had arrived, a man by the name of Antonio El Tigre Mendez. El Tigre was the CJNG's regional commander, sent to bring all independent operators under the cartel's control. He wasn't interested in negotiation, he was interested in domination. El Tigre's arrival signified the beginning of a period of tension for Tomas. The men who worked for him, the quiet network he had painstakingly built over the years, were now under threat. Tomas had never been one to back down from a challenge, but he knew that engaging in open warfare with El Tigre's forces would be a gamble, a dangerous one that could undo everything he had worked for. Instead of responding with force, Tomas decided to respond with silence and strategy. He refused to show any sign of weakness, knowing that to do so would invite further aggression. He let El Tigre and his men assume that Tomas was simply another small-time player, unwilling to confront the CJNG head-on. But Tomas wasn't a man who played his cards recklessly. He didn't challenge El Tigre, instead, he began working the angles. He reached out to several of the CJNG's competitors, offering them the same quiet deal he had used to neutralize earlier threats. Tomas wasn't going to eliminate El Tigre through violence. He was going to outlast him by weakening his position without him even realizing it. He played on the rivalries that existed between cartel factions, offering them his services as a neutral party who could broker deals and manage territories without causing bloodshed. Tomas knew that in the criminal underworld, no one trusted anyone else for long. The constant back and forth of betrayal, intrigue, and shifting allegiances was his playground. Meanwhile, Tomas continued to build his own alliances, expanding his reach into new territories. He cultivated relationships with people in the right places, corrupt law enforcement officers, politicians on the take, and businessmen who profited from the underground economy. These relationships were what kept Tomas's syndicate alive and functioning smoothly. As long as he kept these alliances intact, he would have the protection and resources he needed to continue growing. But Tomas knew that even his vast web of connections wasn't enough to shield him from the growing threats around him. He needed to be more than just a shadow, he needed to have a contingency plan in place. It wasn't long before the tension with El Tigre reached a boiling point. Tomas had been laying low, playing the role of a neutral operator, but word began to spread that the CJNG was making its move to eliminate him. Tomas's network was too valuable to be left untouched, and El Tigre saw him as a potential threat to the cartel's dominance in northern Mexico. Tomas had no intention of engaging in a bloody conflict, but he realized that a decisive move was needed to protect his people and maintain control of his syndicate. The plan Tomas devised was nothing short of brilliant. He knew that the CJNG thrived on fear and intimidation, but their reliance on violence left them vulnerable in the long run. Tomas, ever the strategist, decided to strike at the heart of El Tigre's operation without ever firing a shot. He began to systematically buy up properties, small businesses, and land in areas that were crucial to the CJNG's logistics operations. He didn't make a show of it, he did it quietly, using intermediaries to handle the transactions. As Tomas acquired more and more key locations, he began to tighten his grip on the local economy, making it increasingly difficult for the CJNG to operate in the region without crossing paths with him. The shift was subtle but significant. El Tigre's forces began to feel the pressure as their ability to move freely around Monterrey and the surrounding areas was hindered. Tomas had become a silent roadblock in their path, and El Tigre found himself at a crossroads. He could try to confront Tomas directly, leading to an open war that would drain both sides of valuable resources, or he could recognize Tomas's growing influence and find a way to coexist. For a man like El Tigre, the idea of negotiating was unthinkable. But Tomas had already anticipated this, and he had prepared for every outcome. At the height of the tension, just as it seemed an all-out confrontation was inevitable, Tomas made his move. He didn't wait for El Tigre to make the first strike, instead, he brokered a deal. Tomas reached out to El Tigre's superiors within the CJNG and offered them an olive branch, an opportunity to expand their operations without having to fight for control. Tomas didn't ask for much in return, just a small percentage of the revenue from the areas he controlled, a mere fraction of the profits. His offer was subtle, just enough to make El Tigre's superiors realize that Tomas was not a threat, but a valuable partner. In the end, Tomas had once again avoided a bloody confrontation. El Tigre, unable to refuse such a well-structured deal, accepted the terms, and the two men found a way to coexist, at least for the time being. Tomas's reputation grew even further as someone who didn't just survive the chaos of the criminal world but mastered it. He didn't need to conquer with violence, he conquered through precision, foresight, and the careful balance of power. The Mountain Syndicate, Tomas's silent empire, continued to grow, but Tomas knew that the world he inhabited was full of dangers. He had avoided one threat, but more would undoubtedly come. Still, Tomas Villalobos's ability to remain unseen, to move with the currents of the criminal world rather than fight against them, was what kept him at the top. His quiet strength was unmatched, and with every passing day, his influence grew stronger, even as the world around him remained blissfully unaware of the true power behind the shadows. Tomas Villalobos had always known that the criminal world, though vast and complex, operated on a foundation of fear and loyalty. But as his syndicate expanded, he began to realize that power alone wasn't enough to guarantee long-term success. What he had built wasn't just a network of criminals, it was an intricate system of interconnected relationships, many of which were far more fragile than he'd anticipated. The stability of his empire relied not on brute force, but on his ability to maintain control over those relationships that, if left unchecked, could lead to betrayal, weakness, or worse, chaos. The subtle balance of power Tomas had created began to show cracks when some of his most trusted lieutenants started to exhibit signs of overconfidence. They had been with him from the start, long before the syndicate became a powerhouse, and their loyalty was unquestioned. But Tomas knew the underworld well enough to recognize that loyalty in his world was never a constant. It was a currency that could be bought and sold, manipulated, or, in some cases, broken. This was the reality Tomas had to face as he watched the dynamics of his syndicate shift. The growing success of the Mountain Syndicate had attracted a new kind of greed, one that came not from outside forces, but from within. Among these rising tensions was a key figure, Francisco Paco Estrada, a former street thug who had risen to become one of Tomas's most trusted enforcers. Paco had been with Tomas from the beginning, helping him secure territory and handle the more violent aspects of their operations. Tomas had always valued Paco's street smarts and loyalty, but now, as the syndicate grew, Paco began to act with a boldness that was starting to unsettle Tomas. There was a hunger in him, a drive to prove himself, and Tomas couldn't help but feel that Paco was starting to lose sight of the bigger picture, the quiet, methodical approach that had brought them this far. It wasn't long before Tomas started hearing rumors about Paco's ambitions. The whispers were subtle at first, passed along through trusted channels, but they were there, rumblings of discontent, of power struggles quietly brewing in the underbelly of the syndicate. Tomas had to confront the reality that his inner circle was becoming more unstable. Paco wasn't the only one. Other lieutenants, once loyal to Tomas, were becoming more aggressive, more impatient. Some were becoming reckless, pushing for bigger pieces of the pie, for control over territories Tomas had carefully cultivated. Tomas knew that now was the time to act, before his empire began to crumble from within. He called a meeting of his most trusted advisors, a group of individuals whose loyalty was undoubted, but who had also proven to be adept at keeping their ears to the ground. They were the ones who had helped him build the syndicate's intricate web of influence, men and women who understood the delicate balance Tomas had created. Tomas outlined the situation, speaking calmly but with unmistakable gravity. He knew that any sign of weakness, any hesitation, would be exploited by those around him. It was clear that Paco, in particular, needed to be dealt with. Tomas had built his syndicate with an eye for loyalty and subtlety, but Paco's ambition had become a threat to that very foundation. Tomas knew that confronting him head-on could lead to an open confrontation, something he had worked his entire career to avoid. It wasn't in Tomas's nature to take such risks. Instead, he began working behind the scenes, carefully planting doubts in the minds of his other lieutenants, quietly undermining Paco's growing influence. Tomas had always been a master of manipulation, using psychological tactics to control situations without ever raising his voice. He played the long game, and this time was no different. He began to speak with Paco less frequently, cutting back on the direct communication that had once been a hallmark of their working relationship. Tomas knew that Paco, in his increasing desire for control, would begin to take matters into his own hands if left unchecked. Tomas made sure to remind his lieutenants of the importance of loyalty and patience, subtly reinforcing the idea that those who rushed ahead without understanding the full picture would be left behind. He created a climate of caution, one that made it clear that any attempt to seize power without Tomas's approval would not only be foolish, but would also risk destabilizing the entire syndicate. As Tomas's influence over his inner circle grew stronger, so did the tension with Paco. Tomas had long since learned that the key to keeping power in the criminal world wasn't about being the loudest or the most violent, it was about being the most elusive, the most trusted. But Paco's escalating behavior made him a loose cannon, and Tomas knew that sooner or later, something would have to give. The conflict between them reached its peak when Paco, emboldened by his own ambition, began to take actions without Tomas's consent, trying to seize control of key operations and territories. Tomas, ever the strategist, had already prepared for this moment. He knew that a direct confrontation with Paco could be disastrous, both for their personal relationship and for the syndicate as a whole. Instead, he orchestrated a quiet but definitive move. Tomas reached out to several of Paco's closest allies, men who were once loyal to him but who were also deeply aware of Tomas's control over the syndicate. Through discreet conversations, Tomas made it clear that Paco was becoming a liability, that his actions were threatening the stability of everything they had built. Tomas didn't need to order anyone to act against Paco, he simply planted the seed of doubt, and his allies took care of the rest. It wasn't long before Paco found himself isolated, his support base evaporating as Tomas's influence over the syndicate solidified once again. Paco's once unchallenged rise came to a swift and unceremonious end. Tomas didn't need to kill him or imprison him, he simply removed him from the equation, stripping him of the power he had once held. Paco's downfall was a testament to Tomas's ability to control not just his enemies, but his own people. The syndicate was secure once more, but Tomas knew that this was only one battle in a much larger war. What Tomas had learned, however, was something crucial to his survival. Power wasn't just about control, it was about perception. His ability to manipulate not just the physical aspects of his empire, but the psychological dynamics within it, was what made him untouchable. He had turned what could have been a deadly threat into a quiet resolution, reinforcing his reputation as a leader who could handle crises with a calm and measured hand. The Mountain Syndicate had survived yet another test, and Tomas knew that in the world he operated in, the real battles were never fought with guns, they were fought with influence, loyalty, and the careful cultivation of trust. Tomas Villalobos' syndicate continued to thrive despite the internal turbulence he had managed to quell. His mastery of influence, both within his organization and among the criminal world at large, had ensured that his operations ran smoothly. However, with greater success came greater visibility, and Tomas knew that his growing empire could no longer operate under the radar as it once had. The shadows that had protected him for so long were now thinning, and Tomas understood that this was a moment in time where everything he had built could be destroyed in the blink of an eye. The growing influence of his syndicate caught the attention of more powerful forces beyond just his rivals within the criminal underworld. The Mexican government, law enforcement, and even international agencies were beginning to take a closer look at the activities Tomas's syndicate had been involved in, and they weren't doing so out of curiosity. They were watching, waiting, and working on plans to dismantle what Tomas had so carefully constructed. Tomas knew that while his reach was vast, the might of the government and international law enforcement was something far more dangerous than any cartel he had encountered. Tomas had always prided himself on staying several steps ahead of his enemies, but this was a challenge unlike any other. It wasn't just about outsmarting a rival gang or manipulating a law enforcement official, it was about avoiding the full wrath of state power. Tomas had avoided such scrutiny for years through a combination of subtlety, bribes, and an unwavering sense of caution. However, the closer his operations drew to the heart of the Mexican drug trade and its cross-border connections with the United States, the harder it became to remain unnoticed. As the size of his syndicate grew, so did the risks associated with maintaining it. The first sign of this impending danger came in the form of a seemingly innocuous news report. Tomas had always kept his ear to the ground, paying attention to local and international news, knowing that even the smallest detail could have profound implications. On a quiet evening, as Tomas sipped his usual drink in his private office, the news anchor spoke of a new government initiative, a coordinated effort between Mexican law enforcement and American agencies to target major drug cartels operating along the U.S.-Mexico border. Tomas's syndicate, with its growing power and presence in the region, was now squarely in their sights. The report was brief but significant. Tomas didn't need to hear more. He had seen this scenario before, many times. Governments and law enforcement agencies had long been attempting to dismantle the operations of the most powerful criminal organizations, and they had a disturbing tendency to be successful. But Tomas wasn't about to fall victim to their plans. His instincts told him that he needed to act quickly, before the full force of the law descended upon him. His first move was to tighten the security of his operations. Tomas knew that the government wasn't just going after his syndicate, it was targeting the very infrastructure that made it possible. His network of safehouses, warehouses, and money laundering operations had to be fortified. He instructed his men to increase surveillance, to be vigilant of any signs of surveillance or infiltration. Tomas wasn't just looking for informants, he was looking for anyone who might be working in coordination with law enforcement, anyone who could tip off the authorities to his operations. But Tomas didn't stop there. He knew that a direct confrontation with law enforcement would be disastrous, and he was careful not to escalate the situation. Instead, he used his vast network of contacts to begin gathering information, both within the government and among the cartel underworld. Tomas had always maintained a network of individuals who were either on the payroll or deeply indebted to him. They were businessmen, politicians, and even law enforcement officers who were willing to turn a blind eye, or worse, actively assist him in exchange for a cut of the profits. It was through these connections that Tomas began to gain insight into the government's plans. As the news of the operation became more public, Tomas realized that he was facing a two-front war, one against the government, and one against his increasingly powerful rivals. His syndicate had been under the radar for years, but now, both legal and criminal forces were bearing down on him. Tomas's first priority was to ensure that his operations continued to run, even as the heat intensified. To do this, he started shifting his focus away from the more traditional methods of smuggling and money laundering, which were the most likely to attract attention, and began exploring new avenues of revenue. Tomas's keen eye for opportunities led him to diversify his criminal operations, moving into new areas that would allow him to continue making money while keeping a low profile. He began to invest in legal businesses, fronts for his operations, such as trucking companies, construction firms, and even small tech startups. These ventures allowed Tomas to launder money on a much larger scale, while also giving him the ability to move large sums of cash without attracting suspicion. At the same time, Tomas deepened his relationship with the international drug trade. While his syndicate had always focused primarily on domestic operations, Tomas realized that if he were to stay ahead of the government's crackdown, he would need to establish stronger connections with global drug networks. He forged alliances with powerful figures in Colombia, Venezuela, and even Southeast Asia, ensuring that the flow of illicit goods through his network remained uninterrupted. Tomas's ability to navigate the international drug trade without drawing attention to himself was a testament to his skill as a strategist. His operations were now global in scope, and he had become a key player in an international network of crime. But the growing complexity of his syndicate created new challenges. Tomas had built his empire on secrecy, but as the scope of his operations increased, so did the risks. There were more people involved, more opportunities for betrayal, and more ways for things to go wrong. Tomas had always been meticulous in selecting his lieutenants, but now, with his syndicate sprawling across multiple countries, he had to trust more people than ever before. And with that trust came vulnerability. Tomas began to feel the pressure. The mounting challenges weighed heavily on him, and the strain of managing such a vast network began to show. He spent more sleepless nights in his private office, looking over files, reviewing plans, and making sure that every detail was accounted for. His empire had grown, but the complexity of it had also made it more fragile. Tomas knew that if one link in the chain were to break, everything could come crashing down. Despite the mounting pressure, Tomas remained calm. He had always prided himself on his ability to keep a cool head in the face of danger. In the world of crime, emotions were a liability, and Tomas understood that it was his ability to stay detached that had kept him alive for so long. He took a deep breath, looking out of his office window at the sprawling city below. He was in control, and he wasn't going to let anything, not the law, not the rival cartels, not even his own men, take that away from him. In the end, Tomas Villalobos knew that survival in his world depended on one thing: adaptability. He had built his syndicate by staying ahead of the curve, constantly evolving in the face of new threats. And as the pressure from both law enforcement and rival cartels mounted, Tomas's resolve hardened. He would continue to adapt, to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies, until he had nothing left to fear. The Mountain Syndicate wasn't just a criminal organization, it was Tomas's legacy, and he would protect it at any cost. Tomas Villalobos had spent the better part of his life building something larger than himself. His syndicate had become more than just a criminal empire, it had become a carefully constructed web of influence, built on secrecy, loyalty, and ruthlessness. As his power grew, so did the complexity of the challenges he faced. Tomas knew that the line between success and failure was thin, and in the world he navigated, there were no guarantees. The higher you climbed, the harder the fall, and Tomas had made it his life's work to ensure that the fall would never come for him. But despite his carefully laid plans, the events of the past year had begun to take their toll. His operations were expanding faster than he could control, and with that growth came new, unforeseen complications. Tomas had learned long ago that in his world, power was not just about control, it was about managing risk. And now, risk was beginning to emerge from the most unexpected places. One of the most pressing concerns Tomas faced was the growing influence of a rival cartel, known as the Cazadores. They had risen rapidly in the past few years, capitalizing on the power vacuum left by the dismantling of older, weaker organizations. Their leader, Luis El Lobo Navarro, was a man of ambition and ruthlessness, with no qualms about using violence to achieve his goals. Tomas had been watching him for some time, knowing that El Lobo was no fool. He was a threat, one that couldn't be ignored. At first, Tomas had hoped that El Lobo's rise was nothing more than a flash in the pan, a brief surge of power that would eventually fizzle out. But as the months passed, it became clear that this was not the case. The Cazadores were expanding their territory rapidly, cutting into Tomas's profits and threatening his ability to maintain control over the southern region. For the first time in years, Tomas felt a genuine sense of fear, not for his own life, but for the stability of his empire. What made the situation even more dangerous was the fact that the Cazadores weren't just interested in the territory Tomas had already claimed, they were targeting his allies as well. Tomas had always known that the loyalty of his underlings was a fragile thing. He had built his syndicate on a foundation of mutual interest and calculated trust, but even the most loyal men could be swayed by the promise of more power, more wealth, or more safety. The Cazadores, with their offers of protection and their ruthless tactics, were beginning to lure Tomas's men away, one by one. Tomas was aware of the danger this posed, but he had a unique advantage over most of his rivals: he knew the power of information. He had cultivated an extensive network of spies, informants, and double agents, men and women who were embedded within rival organizations, law enforcement, and even within the cazadores themselves. He trusted them to keep him informed about the cazadores' movements, their plans, and their weaknesses. Tomas understood that knowledge was power, and he was determined to use it to his advantage. It wasn't long before Tomas received word that one of his trusted informants had uncovered something disturbing. El Lobo had begun to make overtures toward Tomas's top lieutenants. The cazadores had offered a deal, territory, money, and protection in exchange for loyalty. Tomas's men, many of whom had been with him for years, were tempted by the prospect of greater power. Tomas could feel the ground shifting beneath him. The whispers of betrayal began to reach his ears, and Tomas knew that the time for subtlety was over. He couldn't afford to wait and hope that his men would remain loyal. He needed to act decisively, or risk losing everything. Tomas's mind worked quickly, calculating his options. A direct confrontation with the cazadores could lead to an all-out war, one that would deplete both organizations and leave both sides vulnerable to law enforcement. But Tomas had never been one for all-out violence unless it was absolutely necessary. He needed to strike at the cazadores, but in a way that would undermine their strength without exposing himself to too much risk. Tomas's plan was simple: divide and conquer. He would create chaos within the cazadores by exploiting the very weaknesses that had allowed them to rise so quickly. El Lobo's cartel was powerful, but it was also unstable. The rapid expansion of the cazadores had led to friction among their ranks. Tomas knew that El Lobo's men were not all as loyal as they seemed, and he saw an opportunity to exploit that. Tomas had spies embedded within the cazadores, and he began to feed them false information, planting seeds of doubt and mistrust among their ranks. As Tomas's spies worked behind the scenes, Tomas also began to make subtle moves of his own. He reached out to some of the cazadores' former allies, those who had been cast aside in the cartel's rise to power. These were men who had once been part of the syndicate, men who had long held grudges against El Lobo. Tomas offered them protection and the opportunity to reclaim their former power in exchange for turning on the cazadores. The men, eager to take advantage of the opportunity, agreed. Tomas knew that by destabilizing El Lobo's alliances, he could weaken the cartel from within. Tomas didn't stop there. He also began to manipulate the law enforcement agencies that were investigating both the Mountain Syndicate and the cazadores. Using his vast network of contacts, Tomas started feeding them false leads, pointing them toward the cazadores' operations while keeping his own activities under the radar. Tomas understood the value of misdirection. By drawing the attention of law enforcement to El Lobo's cartel, he could buy himself time and continue to operate with less scrutiny. The battle between Tomas and El Lobo escalated, but it was a battle of wills more than of violence. Tomas had learned long ago that brute force was rarely the solution. Instead, he used his network, his intelligence, and his ability to manipulate those around him to slowly erode the power of his rival. It wasn't a quick victory, but Tomas knew that in the world he lived in, patience was as important as strength. In the end, the strategy worked. The cazadores began to unravel from within. El Lobo's most trusted men began to desert him, taking with them valuable information and resources. Law enforcement, distracted by the false leads Tomas had planted, began to target the cazadores more aggressively. And while Tomas's own syndicate remained intact, his rival cartel was left weakened, unable to fully capitalize on the power vacuum it had created. Tomas had won this round, but he knew that the battle for supremacy in the underworld was far from over. Tomas leaned back in his chair, contemplating the delicate balance he had to maintain. The cazadores might have been weakened for now, but they were still out there, waiting for the chance to rise again. Tomas understood that the game was never truly won, it was a constant battle for survival. But for now, he had secured his place at the top, and that was all that mattered. The Mountain Syndicate, despite Tomas's tactical brilliance and calculated moves, was facing increasing strain from multiple fronts. Tomas had learned to expect challenges, but the complexity of his problems had never been so all-encompassing. The tensions between rival cartels, the tightening pressure from law enforcement, and the shifting dynamics within his own organization were beginning to feel like a storm that could not be avoided. The weight of these challenges rested squarely on his shoulders, and Tomas knew that even the smallest misstep could send his empire crumbling down. As his syndicate expanded further into the global drug trade, Tomas had begun to realize just how interconnected everything had become. His operations were no longer limited to Mexico or even the United States, his network stretched across continents, touching every corner of the criminal world. This vast web of influence was both an asset and a liability. The further Tomas's syndicate reached, the more vulnerable it became to external forces that Tomas had no control over. One such force came in the form of a cartel that had long remained beneath Tomas's radar, the Los Zetas. While the Cazadores were Tomas's most immediate rival, the Los Zetas were a different breed entirely. They were an elite, militarized organization with a brutal reputation, and they had been steadily expanding their influence in the border region. The Zetas were known for their use of extreme violence and for their ability to infiltrate law enforcement and military institutions, making them a formidable threat. At first, Tomas had underestimated the Zetas, viewing them as a regional threat that could be easily neutralized with the right mix of diplomacy and force. But as their power grew, Tomas realized that they were not a rival to be taken lightly. The Zetas were disciplined, ruthless, and well-funded. They had no interest in the politics of other cartels, they simply sought power, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. Tomas knew that if he didn't act quickly, the Zetas could overrun his operations, disrupting the delicate balance he had worked so hard to establish. The first sign that the Zetas were targeting the Mountain Syndicate came in the form of a direct attack. One of Tomas's most trusted lieutenants, a man named Javier El Sombra Hernandez, was ambushed and killed in a cartel-controlled area near the border. The attack was swift, efficient, and brutal. El Sombra had been one of Tomas's most loyal men, and his loss was a blow to the syndicate. The message was clear, the Zetas were making their move. Tomas could feel the tension in his organization rise. His men were nervous. Javier's death was a stark reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. Tomas knew that if he didn't retaliate quickly, his authority would be questioned, and his empire would begin to unravel. The power dynamics within his own ranks were fragile, loyalty had to be maintained, and fear had to be instilled. Tomas was no stranger to violence, but he understood that it had to be used wisely. A direct confrontation with the Zetas could lead to an all-out war, and Tomas wasn't willing to risk everything on a battle he might not win. Instead of retaliation, Tomas decided on a more calculated approach. He gathered his closest advisors in his private headquarters and began to strategize. Tomas's mind worked quickly, analyzing the situation from every angle. He knew that the Zetas operated with a different set of rules than the Cazadores, and he couldn't afford to treat them the same. He would need to weaken them from the inside, to fracture their organization before they could solidify their hold over the region. Tomas's plan was simple but risky. He had spent years cultivating relationships with informants within the Zetas, men who had infiltrated their ranks in exchange for money or protection. It was these men who would be the key to Tomas's success. Tomas instructed his network of spies to focus on gathering intelligence on the Zetas' movements, their weaknesses, and most importantly, their leaders. He knew that if he could destabilize the Zetas' chain of command, he could force them into a retreat. In addition to intelligence gathering, Tomas began to focus on undermining the Zetas' alliances with other criminal organizations. The Zetas, despite their militarized power, were not invincible. Tomas knew that there were cracks in their unity, and it was these cracks that he would exploit. He reached out to rival cartels that had previously clashed with the Zetas, offering them support in exchange for cooperation. By using these alliances, Tomas could divide the Zetas' forces, weakening their position without having to engage them directly. While Tomas worked behind the scenes, the pressure on his organization continued to mount. The Zetas' assault had been a wake-up call, and Tomas knew that he couldn't afford to let his syndicate become complacent. He doubled down on security, reinforcing the protection around his most vital operations. His men were instructed to be vigilant, and any signs of betrayal were to be reported immediately. Tomas knew that in the criminal world, loyalty could be fleeting. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. But Tomas's concerns weren't limited to external threats. The growing tension within his own organization was just as troubling. As the syndicate expanded, more and more ambitious individuals were vying for power. Tomas had long understood that loyalty was not always enough to ensure stability. There were men in his ranks who had grown restless, who felt they deserved more influence or a larger share of the profits. Tomas could feel the undercurrents of discontent, and he knew that he had to act quickly to reassert his control. The discontent within his syndicate came to a head when one of his top lieutenants, a man named Rodrigo El Diablo Garcia, began to question Tomas's leadership. El Diablo had been with Tomas for years, but recently, he had become increasingly vocal about his dissatisfaction with Tomas's methods. He believed that Tomas was becoming too cautious, too calculating, and that the syndicate was losing its edge. El Diablo's outspokenness and ambition made him a dangerous figure within the organization, and Tomas knew that he had to deal with him before he became a liability. Tomas's solution was swift and decisive. He called El Diablo to a private meeting, knowing that this would be the moment to put an end to any talk of rebellion. Tomas had no patience for dissent. He had built his empire on the principle of absolute control, and he wasn't about to let anyone undermine that. The meeting was brief, but the message was clear: Tomas was in charge, and anyone who threatened that would be dealt with accordingly. After El Diablo's removal, Tomas reinforced his position with a show of force. His lieutenants, seeing the ruthlessness with which he handled dissent, fell back in line. Tomas's leadership was re-established, and the syndicate was able to move forward. But Tomas knew that he couldn't afford to become complacent. The challenges facing him were far from over, and the future of the Mountain Syndicate remained uncertain. In the end, Tomas's empire survived the test. His enemies, both internal and external, were forced to retreat, but the scars of the battle would remain. Tomas understood that survival in his world was not just about overcoming one challenge, it was about adapting to an endless series of threats, both seen and unseen. The Mountain Syndicate had endured yet another crisis, but Tomas knew that the game was far from finished. The real challenge lay ahead, and Tomas was already preparing for the next move. The Mountain Syndicate had endured countless battles, both external and internal, but Tomas knew that the greatest challenge was still to come. As his empire continued to grow, so did the number of enemies, some of whom were lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Tomas had always been a master of foresight, able to anticipate threats before they fully materialized. But there were forces at play that even he had not accounted for. One such force was the growing presence of law enforcement, which had begun to focus its efforts on Tomas's operations with increasing intensity. For years, Tomas had managed to keep his syndicate under the radar of federal agencies, thanks in part to his ability to manipulate and bribe key officials. However, the landscape was changing. New leadership in law enforcement, as well as increased pressure from rival cartels, had forced Tomas into a position where he had to choose between continuing his operations in secrecy or facing the inevitable, an all-out war with the authorities. The growing scrutiny from law enforcement had begun to strain Tomas's ability to operate freely. The feds had made significant headway in their investigations, uncovering more and more of the syndicate's activities. What had once been a quiet, well-oiled machine was now becoming a target. Tomas knew that the longer his syndicate operated in the open, the more likely it was that someone, an informant, a spy, or even a member of his own crew, would betray him. But Tomas wasn't one to panic. He had faced greater threats before, and he would face this one the same way, with patience, calculation, and a willingness to outsmart his enemies. He knew that an all-out war with law enforcement was not the solution. If he allowed his syndicate to draw attention to itself, it would only be a matter of time before the authorities closed in. Instead, Tomas opted for a more subtle approach. He would tighten his operations, create more layers of secrecy, and ensure that his most important ventures remained shielded from prying eyes. To accomplish this, Tomas began to pull back from certain high-profile operations. The flashy displays of wealth and power that had once been a hallmark of the Mountain Syndicate were scaled back. The flashy nightclubs, the lavish parties, and the ostentatious displays of wealth were all put on hold. Instead, Tomas focused on the more discreet parts of his business, the drug shipments that moved quietly through the underground, the money laundering schemes that went unnoticed, and the more clandestine operations that operated beneath the surface. While Tomas's operations became more secretive, he also focused on strengthening his relationships with the key figures who had always been loyal to him. His network of informants and spies grew larger, with trusted individuals embedded in law enforcement, rival cartels, and even the highest levels of government. Tomas knew that information was his greatest weapon, and he used it to stay one step ahead of his enemies. But Tomas's careful maneuvering was not enough to prevent the inevitable. One fateful day, the federal authorities finally made their move. Armed with evidence gathered over months of investigation, they raided several of Tomas's key properties, seizing records, money, and drugs. It was a blow to the syndicate, one that sent shockwaves through Tomas's operation. But Tomas, ever the strategist, had anticipated this day. While the authorities had seized valuable assets, Tomas had already begun moving the most crucial elements of his empire to new, safer locations. His primary focus was now on damage control, minimizing the impact of the raids, and ensuring that the syndicate could continue to operate under the radar. Despite the setback, Tomas was not disheartened. He understood that setbacks were a part of the game. The key was not to avoid failure, but to learn from it and emerge stronger. His ability to adapt and recover from these challenges was what had allowed him to build his empire in the first place. Tomas knew that the authorities had their sights set on him, but he was also aware that they could never truly catch him, at least, not without a fight. In the wake of the raids, Tomas began to reinforce his network, both inside and outside the syndicate. He reached out to allies in the political world, securing new channels of influence that could protect his operations. At the same time, he took steps to eliminate any potential weaknesses within his organization. The loyalty of his men, once a cornerstone of his power, was beginning to fray. Tomas knew that his empire was only as strong as the people who ran it, and he had to ensure that his top lieutenants remained loyal to him above all else. One of Tomas's greatest fears was the possibility of an internal betrayal, something that could unravel everything he had worked for. In an organization as vast as the Mountain Syndicate, it was impossible to keep track of every individual, every minor detail. Tomas had learned to keep his circle small and to rely on a select few for the most sensitive matters. But even with his tight-knit group of trusted lieutenants, Tomas knew that nothing was certain. People changed, and in the world of organized crime, loyalty could be bought and sold. In response to this growing concern, Tomas began to implement a more stringent system of checks and balances. He instituted a new protocol for communications within the syndicate, using encrypted messaging and code words to ensure that any information that left his inner circle was secure. Tomas also made sure that key operations were handled by people he trusted implicitly, individuals who had proven their loyalty over time. As Tomas took these precautions, he also began to consider his long-term future. Despite the setbacks and challenges, he had managed to maintain a stranglehold on his empire. But he understood that no one could stay on top forever. The underworld was a place of constant flux, where new players emerged, and old players faded into obscurity. Tomas had seen it happen time and time again. The key was to remain adaptable, to know when to pivot and when to double down on your strengths. At the same time, Tomas began to think about his legacy. While he had never been one to indulge in thoughts of retirement or slowing down, he knew that one day, the weight of his actions would catch up with him. There were only so many years a man could spend on top of the world before the inevitable fall came. Tomas began to lay the groundwork for a succession plan, carefully selecting a successor who could take the reins when the time came. This wasn't something Tomas had ever wanted to think about, but it was necessary. In the criminal world, succession was often as violent as it was strategic, and Tomas was determined to ensure that the transition would go smoothly. As Tomas looked to the future, he understood that the Mountain Syndicate was entering a new phase. The old ways of doing business were no longer as effective as they once had been. The world was changing, and Tomas needed to change with it. With law enforcement closing in and rival cartels growing stronger, the days of reckless expansion were over. It was time for a new approach, one that would allow Tomas to keep his empire intact while navigating the increasingly dangerous waters of the underworld. Tomas's empire had long been a symbol of power, fear, and wealth. But as the years wore on, cracks began to appear in the once impenetrable facade of the Mountain Syndicate. The Syndicate's operations, though still profitable and vast, were becoming more difficult to manage as the pressures from law enforcement and rival factions mounted. Tomas had spent decades building his empire from the ground up, but now, he found himself facing a new, more subtle challenge, one that would test his leadership in ways he had never imagined. The true test of power, Tomas realized, was not just in conquering territories, but in holding onto them when everything around you seemed to be slipping away. The world of organized crime was evolving, and Tomas knew it. The once thriving networks of drug runners and arms dealers were now being replaced by more sophisticated, less visible operations. Technology was playing an increasingly pivotal role in the underworld, and Tomas had to adapt or risk being left behind. The use of encryption, digital currencies, and online markets had become the new frontier in illicit trade. The Syndicate's traditional methods, bullets, bribes, and intimidation, were still effective, but they were no longer enough to ensure long-term survival in an increasingly connected and digitized world. The first indication that Tomas needed to adjust his strategy came when one of his key operations was disrupted. A shipment of drugs, which had been meticulously planned and timed, was intercepted by authorities, something that had never happened before. The loss was significant, not just in terms of money, but in the damage it did to Tomas's reputation. If his rivals caught wind of this vulnerability, they would surely exploit it. The Mountain Syndicate's reputation had been built on the idea that Tomas was untouchable, that no matter what, he could always outsmart, outrun, or overpower his enemies. This disruption shattered that illusion, and Tomas knew it couldn't be allowed to happen again. The world had changed, but Tomas was determined not to let it change him. Instead of retreating, he doubled down on his empire's strengths. The Syndicate had always been built on a foundation of loyal, trusted men who would follow Tomas to the ends of the earth. These men, many of whom had been with him from the very beginning, had grown accustomed to Tomas's ways. They understood that he valued loyalty above all else, and they knew that he would never hesitate to deal with any betrayal swiftly and decisively. Tomas had always been a leader who kept a tight grip on power, and he wasn't about to loosen that grip now. But as the Syndicate continued to grow, so did the risks. Tomas knew that the competition was getting fiercer, and the threat of betrayal was becoming more and more real. There were whispers within his organization, whispers about new opportunities, new ways to expand, and, most dangerously, whispers about Tomas himself. He was no longer the young, ambitious man who had clawed his way to the top. His grip on the Syndicate was as firm as ever, but time had a way of creating doubt in the minds of even the most loyal followers. Tomas had long relied on fear to maintain control, but fear alone was no longer enough to keep his men in line. The reality was that his once invincible position at the top was now being challenged by younger, hungrier individuals within the Syndicate who saw Tomas as a relic of the past. These men were willing to take risks that Tomas could not afford to take, and they were eager to prove their worth. Tomas knew that these upstarts were dangerous. They had the energy, the ambition, and the ruthlessness to do whatever it took to rise in the ranks. And if they couldn't rise through loyalty, they would rise through betrayal. One of these ambitious men was Manuel El Lobo Garcia, a rising star within the Syndicate. Manuel was young, aggressive, and had an uncanny ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. He had been with the Mountain Syndicate for only a few years, but in that short time, he had proven himself to be a valuable asset. However, Tomas had noticed something unsettling about Manuel. While the young man was skilled, Tomas couldn't shake the feeling that Manuel was always looking for ways to climb higher, ways that might involve stepping on Tomas's back. Tomas had learned over the years that ambition, when unchecked, could be more dangerous than any rival cartel. Tomas didn't act immediately. He never did. Instead, he watched Manuel closely, studying his every move. Tomas was patient. He knew that all things would reveal themselves in time. But as the weeks passed, Tomas began to notice troubling signs. Manuel had begun to gather a group of like-minded men around him, men who were equally eager to prove themselves. They whispered among themselves, made plans, and sought out opportunities that Tomas had not sanctioned. It was a subtle shift, but Tomas could feel it. The tide was changing, and Tomas had to decide whether to let it change him or to fight against it. Eventually, Tomas's worst fears were realized when he received word that Manuel was making moves behind his back, attempting to broker deals with rival cartels. It was a direct violation of Tomas's rules, a betrayal of the highest order. Tomas knew that the time had come. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. If he allowed Manuel to challenge his authority, it would set a dangerous precedent, one that could lead to the disintegration of his empire. Tomas acted swiftly and decisively. He arranged a meeting with Manuel, a private conversation that would determine the young man's future. Tomas had already prepared himself for the worst. He knew that Manuel would likely deny any wrongdoing, perhaps even offer excuses or explanations. But Tomas had no patience for that. In this world, there was no room for weakness. Tomas's message was clear: if Manuel couldn't be trusted, he would be dealt with accordingly. The confrontation was brief, but it was a pivotal moment. Tomas did not hesitate. He made an example of Manuel in front of his inner circle, showing them that disloyalty would not be tolerated. The young man's fate was sealed, and Tomas's grip on the syndicate was reaffirmed. It was a harsh decision, but it was necessary. Tomas understood that loyalty was everything in the underworld, and once it was broken, it could never be repaired. The message was sent, not just to Manuel, but to everyone in the syndicate. Tomas was still in charge, and anyone who thought otherwise would face the same fate. The Mountain Syndicate had survived another internal challenge, but Tomas knew that the battle for control would never truly end. As long as there were men ambitious enough to challenge him, Tomas's leadership would be constantly tested. But he was prepared for that. After all, survival in the criminal world wasn't about avoiding conflict, it was about mastering it. Tomas's empire was in a delicate balance. The ruthless elimination of Manuel had sent a strong message to those within his organization: betrayal would not be tolerated, no matter the cost. But Tomas, despite his display of power, was aware of the deeper currents of change flowing beneath the surface of the Mountain Syndicate. Every empire, no matter how seemingly invincible, was built upon shifting sands, and Tomas's was no exception. His decision to eliminate Manuel had sent a ripple of fear through the syndicate, but it also raised questions: was Tomas's reign becoming more volatile, more unpredictable? The younger men, the ones who had joined the syndicate in its prime, were beginning to murmur about the future. It wasn't just about loyalty anymore. It was about survival, and Tomas's ability to keep up with the evolving world of organized crime. The old ways, brutality, fear, and trust in a few loyal men, were no longer enough. The syndicate had grown too large, its operations too complex, for Tomas to rely solely on these methods. And as Tomas considered the future, he understood that he could no longer be a man of the past. The rise of technology and the global interconnectedness of the criminal underworld were reshaping everything. Drug cartels, money laundering networks, and arms traffickers were no longer limited to the streets of New York or the border towns of Mexico. They were global, operating through encrypted channels, using digital currencies, and leveraging cybercrime to expand their influence. Tomas had always prided himself on being a master strategist, but even he had to admit that this new landscape was beyond the reach of his traditional methods. He could no longer rely solely on old-school muscle, bribery, and influence. To survive, he had to evolve. The first step in this evolution was understanding the tools of the modern criminal world. Tomas had always been a man who valued intelligence over brute force, but the digital age demanded a different kind of savvy. He began to surround himself with a new breed of men, men who understood technology, men who could navigate the complexities of the internet, digital currency, and encrypted communications. They were outsiders, not the traditional mobsters Tomas had grown up with, but they were essential to the survival of his empire. These men were the ones who could help Tomas adapt to a rapidly changing world. But even as Tomas adapted, he was forced to contend with the growing reach of law enforcement. The authorities were learning, too. With the rise of the internet and digital surveillance, the criminal world was becoming more visible. Every transaction, every encrypted message, every online purchase could be traced back to its source. It was no longer enough to bribe a few cops and hide in plain sight. The syndicate had to operate with even more caution than before. Tomas knew that his old ways, of trusting a handful of loyal men and keeping everything close to his chest, were no longer enough to protect him from the law's ever-reaching hand. He needed to think ahead, to stay ahead of the game. As he adjusted his operations, Tomas also had to contend with a new wave of competition. The rise of other criminal organizations was becoming more pronounced, and Tomas's once unassailable position was now being challenged. Rival syndicates were starting to creep into his territory, vying for control of the markets he had once ruled with impunity. The old alliances were beginning to crack, as Tomas found himself at odds with former partners. Once, Tomas had relied on his ability to broker deals and keep enemies at bay, but now, the situation was different. The rival factions were no longer interested in negotiations, they wanted what Tomas had built. And they were willing to go to extreme lengths to get it. The Mountain Syndicate, once a well-oiled machine that ran like clockwork, was now a precarious empire built on fragile alliances. Tomas knew that it was only a matter of time before one of his rivals made a move to seize control. The threat was no longer hypothetical, it was real, and it was growing by the day. Tomas had always prided himself on his ability to handle threats before they fully materialized, but now, he faced an enemy that was just as cunning and resourceful as he was. But Tomas was not a man who would go down without a fight. He was always prepared for war, and he was willing to do whatever it took to protect what he had built. The key, he knew, was to stay one step ahead of his enemies. He began to build alliances with new players, ones that operated in the shadows. He reached out to international contacts, some from countries where law enforcement was weaker, others from regions where governments had little control over the criminal underworld. Tomas understood that survival in the modern world required a global perspective. His empire could no longer be confined to the borders of the United States. It had to expand into new territories, and he needed new allies to make that possible. The syndicate's operations expanded into Central and South America, where Tomas found fertile ground for new ventures. He began to broker deals with smaller cartels, offering protection and resources in exchange for loyalty and business. Tomas knew that alliances in this part of the world could help him keep his enemies at bay. But the further he expanded, the more complicated things became. Tomas had always been a master of controlling his turf, but now, he was forced to deal with a new set of challenges: language barriers, unfamiliar political landscapes, and the constant threat of betrayal from those he couldn't trust. Tomas's efforts to grow the syndicate into new territories were not without their complications. In his attempt to expand into the heart of Latin America, Tomas encountered resistance from local cartels who viewed him as an outsider. They were wary of his influence and saw him as a threat to their own power. What followed was a delicate series of negotiations, backdoor deals, and subtle manipulations to gain ground in these new territories. Tomas was well versed in the art of negotiation, but these local cartels were no pushovers. They had their own agendas, and Tomas had to tread carefully to avoid all-out war. At the same time, Tomas had to keep an eye on his old turf in the United States. While his international operations were expanding, his home base was still under constant threat. Law enforcement was never far behind, and Tomas knew that the longer he operated in the open, the more vulnerable he became. The authorities were not just focusing on the syndicate, they were focusing on him. Tomas's name had become synonymous with crime, power, and wealth, and the government was determined to bring him down. The raids, the investigations, the surveillance, it was all beginning to take a toll on Tomas's operations. As the pressure mounted, Tomas had to make difficult decisions. He could no longer afford to be everywhere at once. He began to delegate more authority to his trusted lieutenants, including his key figures in the international operations. But even as Tomas's network of influence grew, so did the number of potential threats. There was no way to keep track of every single person in the syndicate, and Tomas knew that some of his men might be tempted to turn against him, especially as the stakes grew higher. Tomas's life had always been defined by danger, but now, the danger was more pervasive than ever. It wasn't just the rival cartels or law enforcement that he had to worry about, it was the constant shifting of loyalties within his own ranks. Tomas had built his empire through strength and cunning, but as he faced his most significant challenges yet, he realized that his survival would depend on his ability to navigate a world that was increasingly difficult to control. Tomas had weathered many storms in his time, but the challenges he now faced seemed to test the very foundation of the Mountain Syndicate. As his empire expanded, the external pressures of rival cartels and law enforcement grew stronger. At the same time, Tomas's internal struggles began to take on a new intensity. In the world of organized crime, loyalty was the most valuable currency, but as Tomas's empire grew, so did the potential for betrayal. His empire, once a well-oiled machine, was now under siege, not just from external forces, but from within. The expansion of the syndicate into international territories had come with its own set of challenges. While Tomas's reputation as a feared leader helped to solidify his position in new markets, he quickly discovered that running operations in foreign lands wasn't as simple as it had been back in the United States. In these new regions, Tomas wasn't just dealing with rival cartels, he was dealing with deeply entrenched political corruption, regional power struggles, and, most troubling of all, a rising tide of discontent within his own ranks. One of the most pressing concerns Tomas faced was the growing influence of his lieutenants. These were the men he had relied on for years, his closest allies who had helped him build his empire from the ground up. But now, as the syndicate's operations spread further into Latin America and other parts of the globe, Tomas found himself becoming increasingly disconnected from his own operations. He had once prided himself on being a hands-on leader, but as the business grew, so did the need for delegation. Tomas began to notice the subtle shifts in his lieutenants' behavior. They were no longer content with simply running the day-to-day operations, they were seeking more power, more control, and most dangerously, more independence. It was a familiar pattern in the criminal world, the rise of ambitious underlings seeking to carve out their own fiefdoms. Tomas had dealt with this issue before, but now the stakes were higher. The syndicate was no longer a small, tight-knit group of loyal men. It had grown into a sprawling empire, with operations spread across multiple continents. The men who had once been fiercely loyal to Tomas were now being seduced by the allure of power. Tomas had always known that loyalty had its limits, but now, as the syndicate's influence reached new heights, he realized that keeping his men in check would require more than just fear and intimidation. The most troubling of these rising figures was Felipe El Tigre Ramirez, a young but ambitious lieutenant who had quickly become one of Tomas's most trusted men. Felipe was smart, ruthless, and driven, qualities Tomas had once admired in him. But as the years went on, Tomas began to notice a change in Felipe's demeanor. He had started to operate more independently, making deals with other cartels and establishing connections outside of Tomas's direct influence. While Tomas had given him the autonomy to run certain operations, Felipe's growing power began to feel like a threat to Tomas's own authority. Tomas knew that Felipe had the ambition to become more than just a lieutenant. The question was, how far would Felipe be willing to go to achieve that goal? The tension between Tomas and Felipe reached a boiling point when Felipe secretly brokered a deal with a rival cartel, the Los Reyes cartel, without consulting Tomas first. This was a direct violation of Tomas's rule, no deals were to be made without his approval. Felipe's actions were not only a betrayal of Tomas's trust but also a dangerous move that risked exposing the syndicate to a rival force that could destabilize everything Tomas had built. Tomas was furious. The anger burned inside him like a slow fuse, knowing that Felipe had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Tomas called Felipe into his office for a private meeting. It was a confrontation Tomas had been dreading, but he knew it was inevitable. The moment had come when Tomas would have to decide whether to let Felipe's ambition run unchecked or deal with it decisively. Felipe entered the room with the air of a man who had nothing to fear. He had always been confident, but now, Tomas could see the glint of arrogance in his eyes. Felipe had become too comfortable, too certain of his own power. Tomas did not waste time with pleasantries. "You've made a deal with the enemy," he said, his voice calm but laced with anger. Felipe tried to defend himself, explaining that the deal with Los Reyes would benefit the syndicate in the long run. But Tomas wasn't interested in justifications. He had spent his life building the Mountain Syndicate into the powerhouse it was, and he wasn't about to let one man jeopardize everything for the sake of his own ambition. The meeting ended with Felipe leaving Tomas's office, his future hanging in the balance. Tomas had to make a decision. He couldn't afford to let this betrayal slide, but he also couldn't afford to show weakness. Felipe was valuable to the syndicate, but his disobedience was a direct challenge to Tomas's authority. Tomas knew that the syndicate was at a crossroads. If he let Felipe's disloyalty go unpunished, it would send a message to the rest of his men that Tomas was weak. But if he dealt with Felipe too harshly, it might spark a rebellion that could tear the syndicate apart. Tomas's decision came swiftly. He arranged for Felipe to be removed from his position, though he was careful to avoid making an example of him in front of the rest of the organization. Felipe was given a choice: leave the syndicate and live, or remain and face the consequences. Tomas understood that Felipe had a family, a history with the syndicate. Killing him outright would have been a waste. Instead, Tomas offered him a way out. Felipe, unwilling to face the consequences of his actions, chose to leave the syndicate. It was a moment of quiet triumph for Tomas. He had maintained control without spilling blood, a rare achievement in his line of work. However, Tomas knew that Felipe's departure wasn't the end of the story. He had lost one of his most trusted lieutenants, and that left a hole in his organization. The Mountain Syndicate was becoming a more fragile entity, stretched thin by its international operations and internal tensions. Tomas realized that he couldn't continue to rely on the old model of leadership forever. He needed new blood, new strategies, and perhaps most importantly, new alliances if he hoped to maintain control of the syndicate in the coming years. As Tomas looked out over the sprawling city that had once been his kingdom, he knew that the battle for power was far from over. Felipe's defection had been a wake-up call. Tomas could no longer afford to rest on his laurels or assume that his position was untouchable. The world was changing, and if he was to survive, he would have to change with it. The future of the Mountain Syndicate was uncertain, and Tomas understood that the price of survival was always high. He had built an empire that spanned continents, but the true challenge was not in creating power, it was in holding onto it when so many forces, both internal and external, were working to bring it down. Tomas's empire, once a symbol of ruthless power and unchallenged authority, was now facing cracks from within that could no longer be ignored. The departure of Felipe El Tigre Ramirez, though managed quietly, had sent ripples through the ranks of the syndicate. Tomas had maintained his grip on power through sheer will, but the growing uncertainty was hard to conceal. He had always prided himself on his ability to read the room, to sense when his men were becoming restless, but even he couldn't deny that the winds of change were now blowing in a direction he couldn't control. His empire, built on loyalty, fear, and discipline, was beginning to shift under the weight of its own success. With the loss of Felipe, Tomas found himself more isolated than ever. His once ironclad circle of loyal lieutenants was beginning to fray, and the foundation of his operations, what had once been a well-organized and efficient system, now seemed precarious. Tomas had built the Mountain Syndicate into a sprawling criminal network that spanned continents, but the larger it grew, the more difficult it became to manage. Every decision had ramifications, and every ally had their own agenda. The power that Tomas had once wielded with certainty was now slipping through his fingers, as his own men began to question his ability to lead them through the changing times. Despite this, Tomas was not a man to be easily defeated. His mind worked constantly, searching for ways to solidify his position once more. He understood that the key to regaining control of the syndicate lay in recalibrating the balance of power, and that meant finding new ways to reinforce his authority and adapt to the rapidly changing criminal world. The problem, however, was that Tomas was no longer just battling rival cartels and law enforcement, he was also battling the shifting attitudes of the very men who had helped him build his empire. Tomas knew that fear alone couldn't hold the syndicate together forever. It was something he had relied on in the past, his reputation for ruthlessness, his ability to enforce his will with violent precision. But now, as new players entered the scene, fear had started to lose its edge. The younger generation of criminals, those who had grown up with technology and the digital world, were less intimidated by Tomas's old-school methods. They had their own ideas about how to operate, and Tomas was finding it harder to keep up with them. One of the biggest challenges Tomas faced was the rise of new criminal technologies. The digital revolution had not passed him by, but Tomas had been slow to adapt. While his lieutenants had helped him move into international drug trade and money laundering networks, Tomas had failed to recognize the true scope of the Internet's impact on the criminal world. What had once been a game of street deals, handshakes, and shady contacts was now a complex network of encrypted messages, online transactions, and virtual currencies. Tomas had always prided himself on being a strategic mastermind, but the digital world posed new challenges that even he couldn't anticipate. The syndicate's operations, which had once relied heavily on physical transactions, had begun to evolve. Drug shipments, once moved across borders with the help of trusted smugglers, were now being transported via encrypted dark web markets and online money laundering operations. Tomas, despite his sharp mind, was increasingly finding himself out of his depth in this new landscape. His traditional methods of controlling the syndicate, using muscle, bribing officials, and making deals with other criminal factions, were becoming less effective. Tomas was no longer dealing with just men in back rooms and smoky bars, he was now facing faceless enemies, international networks that operated through layers of encryption and anonymity. To make matters worse, Tomas had never been particularly comfortable with technology, a fact that became a liability as his empire grew. The syndicate's financial operations, once controlled with meticulous precision, were now vulnerable to the advancements of digital currency. Tomas's traditional money laundering networks, which had once relied on physical cash and complex offshore accounts, were now being undermined by the rise of cryptocurrency. The anonymity provided by digital currencies like Bitcoin allowed rival factions to move large sums of money without detection. Tomas knew that he needed to understand this new form of money laundering if he was to stay ahead, but the learning curve was steep. The digital world was moving too quickly for him to keep up. As Tomas grappled with these new challenges, his internal struggles deepened. He had always believed in the value of loyalty, but the betrayal of Felipe had shown him that loyalty, at least in the traditional sense, could no longer be taken for granted. The syndicate's growth had created an environment in which the very concept of loyalty had become complicated. Tomas's men were no longer the simple street soldiers he had once commanded, they were now sophisticated players, navigating a complex web of allegiances, deals, and power plays. Tomas's failure to adapt to this new reality was creating fissures within his organization. To address this, Tomas began to focus on bringing in new blood, men and women who were not bound by the old rules of loyalty and fear, but who understood the digital world and the complexities of modern criminal enterprises. Tomas was no longer content with just a few trusted lieutenants, he needed a broader network of operatives who could help him navigate the changing landscape of organized crime. He began to build relationships with hackers, money launderers, and tech-savvy criminals who understood the inner workings of the digital world. These new recruits were not traditional mobsters, but they brought something invaluable to the table, knowledge and skills that Tomas needed to survive in the modern world. At the same time, Tomas was forced to confront the growing presence of law enforcement. The police were no longer just local beat cops or corrupt officials, they were now a global force, working across borders and jurisdictions to track down organized crime. Tomas knew that the law was closing in on him, and the pressure was starting to mount. Surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover operations were becoming increasingly common, and Tomas had to adjust his operations to stay out of sight. The old methods of bribing local cops were no longer enough to keep the heat off him. He had to rely on his new recruits, cyber experts and hackers, who could help him stay hidden in the digital world. But even as Tomas worked to adapt to the changing times, he could not shake the feeling that he was losing control. The syndicate was growing more fragmented, and Tomas found it harder to keep track of all the moving parts. His once unified empire was beginning to splinter as new players entered the game and rival factions moved in on his turf. Tomas understood that this was the price of success: the larger the empire, the more difficult it became to control. But it was also a reality he had never fully anticipated. Tomas had always believed that he could control everything, but now he was faced with the harsh truth: no empire, no matter how powerful, could remain unchallenged forever. As he sat in his office late one night, staring out at the city lights below, Tomas realized that the world he had built was no longer his alone. The Mountain Syndicate was no longer just his empire, it was a battleground, a complex network of alliances, rivalries, and shifting loyalties. And Tomas, once the undisputed king of his criminal world, was now just another player, trying to stay one step ahead in a game that was evolving faster than he could control. As Tomas struggled to keep his empire intact amidst the shifting tides of power, the nature of his leadership began to change. His once mighty grip on the Mountain Syndicate had started to feel more like a tenuous hold, with forces beyond his control chipping away at the foundation he had worked so hard to build. The loss of Felipe, the rise of new technologies, and the growing sense of unrest among his lieutenants were only the beginning of his troubles. Tomas knew that in this world, power was never permanent. It was always in flux, always vulnerable to external and internal forces that could turn the tide of fortune at any moment. But Tomas was not one to concede defeat easily. Despite the mounting challenges, he had an uncanny ability to adapt, to weather the storms that others might succumb to. However, there was a growing sense of unease within him that he could not shake. He had spent his life building this empire with one goal in mind: to establish something lasting, something that could stand the test of time. But as his empire expanded, it began to feel as though it was becoming something else entirely, a ticking time bomb, fragile and ready to explode under the weight of its own ambition. One of the most significant developments in Tomas's life during this period was the growing influence of rival cartels. As the Mountain Syndicate expanded its operations into new territories, Tomas quickly realized that competition was not something he could ignore. For years, he had focused on building his own empire without paying much attention to the threats from other criminal organizations. But now, as his syndicate's reach extended beyond the United States and into Latin America, Europe, and even parts of Asia, he found himself in direct conflict with other powerful groups who had their own designs on the same lucrative markets. The first signs of this new competition came from the Mexican cartel, Los Reyes, who had made inroads into territories that Tomas had once considered under his control. The move was not a surprise, as Los Reyes had long been a growing force in the world of organized crime, but it was a wake-up call for Tomas. He had always known that the criminal world was competitive, but he had underestimated the scale of the challenge that was now facing him. Los Reyes wasn't just another small-time cartel, it was a powerful, well-organized group with the resources and ruthlessness to challenge Tomas for dominance. At first, Tomas tried to negotiate with the leaders of Los Reyes, hoping to find a way to coexist without direct conflict. He had always been pragmatic, and he understood the value of alliances in this brutal world. But negotiations broke down quickly. Los Reyes was not interested in sharing territory, they wanted dominance, and they were willing to do whatever it took to seize control. Tomas found himself facing an adversary that was not only as ruthless as he was but also more willing to take risks, to engage in open warfare rather than covert manipulation. As the situation with Los Reyes escalated, Tomas found himself forced to make a decision. He could continue to try to negotiate and risk losing his position of power, or he could take a more direct approach and confront the cartel head-on. Tomas was not a man who shied away from conflict, but this was different. This was no longer just about maintaining control over his own operations, this was about survival. If Los Reyes successfully toppled him, it would mean the end of the Mountain Syndicate, and with it, everything Tomas had worked for. The choice was clear: Tomas would fight back. He mobilized his resources, gathering his most trusted lieutenants, including those few loyal enough to still see him as their leader. A wave of violence swept through the streets as the two cartels clashed, with Tomas's forces and Los Reyes engaging in bloody turf wars that left entire neighborhoods destroyed and countless bodies in the streets. Tomas had always known that this was the reality of his world, but he had never imagined that his empire would face such a direct, violent challenge to its very existence. The battle for control was not limited to just physical violence. Tomas's enemies in Los Reyes were savvy in their use of media, turning public opinion against him by framing the conflict as a fight for justice, a battle between good and evil. Tomas's syndicate, with its history of brutality and corruption, was painted as a menace to society. The public relations war quickly turned in favor of Los Reyes, and Tomas found himself increasingly isolated, not just from his enemies, but from the public who had once feared and revered him. The more violent the conflict became, the more Tomas's position seemed to weaken. He had always known that being a criminal mastermind came with a price, but now, as his reputation began to crumble, he realized just how high that price was. Amidst the chaos, Tomas's inner circle began to fracture further. The men who had once been his most loyal supporters now started questioning his leadership. Was he still the same man who had led them to the heights of power? Or was he becoming a liability, a king on the verge of losing his throne? Tomas could feel the shift in the air as those around him began to entertain the idea of betrayal. His once unified organization was now a fractured, paranoid entity, with everyone scrambling to secure their own future. Tomas's most trusted advisors, the ones he had spent years cultivating, began to look elsewhere. Some of them, like Sergio the Fox Alvarez, a seasoned enforcer, began to entertain the idea of switching allegiances, offering their services to Los Reyes in exchange for a more secure position. Others, like the cunning Maria La Serpiente Perez, began to play both sides, feigning loyalty while plotting her own rise to power. Tomas had always prided himself on his ability to read people, but now, with his empire under siege, he found himself second-guessing every move, unsure who could be trusted. In the midst of this turmoil, Tomas made a fateful decision: he would meet with the leaders of Los Reyes directly, face to face, to attempt one final negotiation. He had always believed that diplomacy was just as important as force in the criminal world, and he hoped that by meeting with the cartel's leaders, he could secure some form of peace, if not an alliance, at least a temporary truce. Tomas knew that he couldn't win this war through brute force alone. He needed to outmaneuver Los Reyes at the negotiating table, to play the game with the same ruthlessness he had used in the past. The meeting took place in a secluded villa in the mountains, far from the eyes of law enforcement and the prying public. Tomas arrived with his closest lieutenants, all of them on high alert, knowing that this could be a trap. The leaders of Los Reyes arrived in a similar fashion, their faces cold and unreadable. Tomas's instincts were on high alert, but he couldn't afford to show fear. This was his last chance to save the syndicate. The negotiation began quietly, each side laying out their terms. Tomas knew that he could never fully trust the leaders of Los Reyes, but he was willing to offer a temporary peace. In exchange for a guarantee of control over certain territories, he offered to work together on joint operations, sharing the profits. Tomas knew that this was a dangerous game, but he was prepared to play it. The leaders of Los Reyes listened, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like a deal might be struck, but Tomas knew better than to believe in easy solutions. The criminal world didn't work that way. Trust, in their world, was a fragile thing, and the moment you lowered your guard, you became a target. As the meeting concluded, with no clear resolution, Tomas left the villa feeling a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He had survived the negotiation, but he knew the battle was far from over. The war with Los Reyes had only just begun, and the Mountain Syndicate's future remained uncertain. Tomas's empire was in peril, and he realized that his fight for survival had only just begun. The tension in Tomas's world continued to escalate as the battle with Los Reyes dragged on. The meeting in the mountain villa had not yielded the resolution he had hoped for, and now, more than ever, Tomas understood that he was caught in a high-stakes game of survival. The war with Los Reyes wasn't just about control of territory anymore, it had become a matter of pride, of maintaining his identity as the undisputed kingpin of the Mountain Syndicate. And as the conflict deepened, so too did the divisions within his own ranks. One of the most concerning shifts in Tomas's world was the increasing paranoia among his lieutenants. Loyalty, once the bedrock of the Mountain Syndicate, was now a commodity, something to be bought, sold, and questioned. Tomas had built his empire on a foundation of unwavering loyalty, but now, the men who had once pledged their allegiance to him without question were starting to entertain other options. The growing instability of the syndicate made them nervous. Tomas could feel the cracks widening, and he knew that he needed to shore up his position before the entire house of cards collapsed. The first signs of this unrest came from one of his most trusted lieutenants, a man named Carlos El Lobo Rivera. Carlos had been with Tomas from the very beginning, a steady presence in the syndicate who had helped Tomas establish control over key territories in Mexico and the United States. But lately, Carlos had been distant, his once fiery loyalty now replaced by a cool detachment that Tomas found troubling. The meetings between them had become less frequent, and when they did speak, Carlos seemed distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere. Tomas, ever perceptive, recognized the shift in Carlos's demeanor and decided to confront him. Late one night, Tomas called him to his private office, the shadows of the room amplifying the tension that hung in the air. As Carlos walked in, Tomas could see the unease in his eyes. There was something different about the man who had once been his right-hand enforcer. Tomas didn't waste time with pleasantries. He asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks, "What's going on, Carlos? You've been distant." Carlos shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering to the floor before meeting Tomas's eyes. "It's not that simple, Tomas," he said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "Things are changing. The syndicate is changing. And I'm not sure I can keep up with it." Tomas frowned. "What do you mean?" Carlos sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his words was too much to bear. "The world is different now, Tomas. We're fighting a new kind of war. It's not just about the streets and the guns anymore. There are new players, new technologies. And I'm starting to think maybe we've gone too far." The admission struck Tomas harder than he expected. For a moment, he felt the ground beneath him shift. He had always prided himself on his ability to adapt, but hearing his loyal lieutenant express doubt was a reminder of just how precarious his position had become. The truth was, Tomas had always known that the criminal world was evolving, but he had hoped that his experience and ruthlessness would keep him ahead of the curve. Now, as Carlos spoke, Tomas realized that he had been wrong. The world was changing in ways he hadn't anticipated, and the power he had once wielded with confidence was now slipping away. Carlos's words hung in the air, and Tomas struggled to find the right response. But before he could speak, Carlos continued. "I'm not saying I'm going to leave, Tomas. But I think you need to start thinking about the future. If we keep going down this path, we're going to destroy everything we've built. There has to be another way." The conversation lingered in Tomas's mind long after Carlos left the room. He had always known that power was fragile, that empires were not built to last forever. But he had never imagined that the downfall would come from within, from the very people who had helped him build it. Tomas had always been able to read the motivations of others, to sense when they were starting to doubt him. But with Carlos, it was different. This wasn't just about ambition or self-preservation. This was about something deeper, a shift in the very foundation of the syndicate. For the next few days, Tomas found himself increasingly isolated. His inner circle, once a tight-knit group of loyal soldiers, was now filled with doubt and suspicion. Tomas couldn't help but feel that the very loyalty he had once relied on was now a thing of the past. He tried to reassure his men, to remind them of the power and wealth they had gained under his leadership. But the cracks were too wide to ignore. The syndicate was no longer the same machine it had once been. It was a fragmented, uncertain entity, held together by threads that seemed to grow thinner with each passing day. At the same time, Tomas was forced to contend with the growing pressure from law enforcement. The authorities, sensing an opportunity to strike while the syndicate was vulnerable, began ramping up their efforts to dismantle the Mountain Syndicate. Surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover operations became more frequent, and Tomas found himself constantly on edge, unable to trust even his closest allies. Every move, every conversation, became a potential risk. He had always known that the law was a threat, but now it felt like an insurmountable force, one that was closing in on him from all sides. The pressure from Los Reyes also continued to mount. Despite Tomas's efforts to negotiate a truce, the cartel refused to back down. The war between the two organizations had become a bloody and relentless affair, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Tomas's men were beginning to question whether the fight was worth it. Some had grown tired of the constant bloodshed, while others were simply afraid of the consequences. As the violence escalated, Tomas began to wonder if the syndicate could survive the cost of this war. How much more could they lose before it was no longer worth fighting for? It was during this period of uncertainty that Tomas began to question his own choices. Had he made the right decisions? Had his pursuit of power and control been worth the price? His empire, once an unstoppable force, now felt fragile and on the brink of collapse. Tomas had spent his entire life building this criminal empire, but now, as the world around him seemed to crumble, he couldn't help but feel that it was all slipping away. The mistakes of the past were catching up with him, and he was no longer sure how to stop the inevitable decline. Tomas's thoughts became increasingly scattered, his mind clouded by doubt and regret. He had always been the architect of his own destiny, but now he found himself at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. Should he continue to fight, holding on to what was left of his empire, or should he walk away before everything was destroyed? The choices before him were more difficult than ever, and Tomas knew that whatever he decided, it would have far-reaching consequences. As he sat in the darkness of his office one evening, Tomas realized that the time for easy answers had passed. The world had changed, and so too had he. The Mountain Syndicate, which had once been a symbol of his power and ingenuity, was now a shell of its former self. The question was no longer whether he could rebuild it, but whether he was even capable of leading it through this storm. The fight for survival had never been more real, and Tomas was beginning to understand that it was a battle he might not be able to win. The internal turmoil within Tomas's empire continued to intensify as his hold on the Mountain Syndicate grew increasingly fragile. The once united front of loyal lieutenants now appeared to be splintering, and Tomas's efforts to reassert control were met with growing resistance. His trusted allies, who had stood by him through countless battles, now whispered behind his back, questioning his ability to lead them through this new era of criminal enterprise. To make matters worse, the growing pressure from law enforcement, coupled with the relentless assault from Los Reyes, made Tomas feel like he was trapped in a vice. Each move he made seemed to be under scrutiny, and every mistake was amplified. Even his closest confidants were showing signs of doubt, and Tomas began to wonder if he had reached the end of his reign. What had once been an unshakable empire was now a crumbling fortress, beset on all sides by enemies, both external and internal. The path ahead was unclear, and Tomas knew that he could no longer operate as he had before. But the question remained, could he find a way to salvage what remained of the syndicate, or was it already too late for redemption? His legacy was on the line, and only time would reveal whether Tomas, Shadow Tunnel, Villalobos could survive the fallout of his own empire's collapse. The slow unraveling of Tomas's empire came to a head one fateful evening when news arrived that one of his most trusted allies had been killed in an ambush. The shock reverberated through the remaining ranks of the Mountain Syndicate. Tomas, already worn thin by the constant betrayals and mounting pressure, felt the weight of the loss deeply. This man had been a cornerstone of his operation, and his death symbolized everything that was now slipping from Tomas's grasp. As the news of the murder spread, it became clear that Tomas was no longer in control. The cartel war with Los Reyes had escalated, with casualties mounting on both sides. But the real blow came from within. Tomas's own people, once fiercely loyal, were beginning to jump ship, seeking safer ground. They had seen the writing on the wall. The Mountain Syndicate was no longer the formidable force it had once been. In the wake of the loss, Tomas found himself facing a choice he had never imagined: fight to the bitter end or cut his losses and disappear. The man who had once ruled with such certainty was now a shadow of himself, clinging to the remnants of power as his empire crumbled. The game was over. Tomas had reached the final chapter of his story. In the end, Tomas Villalobos' story faded into the quiet echoes of history. His name, once spoken with both reverence and fear, became nothing more than a whispered memory in the underworld. The Mountain Syndicate, the empire he had built from nothing, had crumbled with his retreat. It was a tale of rise and fall, of ambition and betrayal, of power and its inevitable cost. Tomas's legacy was sealed, not in the sprawling reaches of his cartel, but in the lessons left behind, the understanding that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape the consequences of their choices. As time passed, those who remembered him spoke not only of his ruthless reign but also of his eventual isolation, the slow unraveling of a man who had once commanded all. The Mountain Syndicate would remain a shadow of what it once was, a distant memory of a time when Tomas Villalobos ruled the mountains with an iron fist. His death, as quiet as the life he lived in his final years, became the final chapter of a saga that spanned generations. And in the shadows where he had once thrived, others would rise, learn, and inevitably fall, repeating the cycle Tomas had known all too well. His story, like the Syndicate, would become a part of the legend, a warning and a reminder of the fleeting nature of power.